You know that Parks and Rec meme? I don't know what blank is, but at this point I'm too afraid to ask. For a long time, that was me with coin games. I'd see the term thrown around the corners of the board game interwebs, but it wasn't until after I started reviewing games that I learned that coin had nothing to do with varying chunks of metal and was GMT's Counterinsurgency series, a set of games that holds such a place of reverence that some consider them a hobby into and of themselves. Dynamic, asymmetric, thematically rich, and mechanically dense, they are among the most critically acclaimed historical games on the market, though their complexity stands them in firm contrast with the typical hobby board game fare. But given that I'd never played a coin game before, I decided it was time to cross it off my list, starting with the two-player, self-purportedly solitaire-suitable Colonial Twilight. Colonial Twilight is about the mid-20th century's French-Algerian War, in which the French occupational government was facing off with the Front de Libération Nationale, FLN for short. Each player is vying for local support of their respective causes from regional populations in Algeria. At certain intervals in the game, victory is checked, and if the French player has a certain threshold of combined local support and commitment from their bros back in the motherland, they win. Alternatively, if the FLN has enough support for independence combined with bases riddled across the land, victory is theirs. While this is a heavyweight game with loads of nuance, the overall structure is relatively concise. Each round, a card from the event deck is flipped, and then, in one of the coolest action selection systems I've seen in ages, the first priority player selects an action in a grid. Then the second priority player must select an action adjacent to that selection of a different color. The colors are shorthand for the overall capability of that player in the round, but also going big means that you are going second priority next turn. The actions themselves are usually utilizing major or minor operations available to your faction and/or gaining control of the round's event card. And while the individual capabilities and resource production and card effects and component limitations are different for each side, the fundamental aspects of moving units, what constitutes control of the territory, and other structural mechanical elements of the game are consistent. These operations drive the complexity of the game, though what's impressive is that it's not that the actual resolution is hard, it's that there are so many tactical options in what you choose, where you perform it, and how you choose to resolve it, with all sorts of conditional limitations and rippling consequences, that it makes for an extremely dense but satisfying game, though be prepared to reference rules time and time again. But once you make it work, whew, boy, even playing single player, there were some of the coolest interactions between thematic concepts and cold hard mechanisms I've seen in games, period. Take, for instance, the FLN's gorillas with their awesome green foil emblems. You can flip them face up to participate in combat or gather resources, but face down, these are shadow warriors who can perform covert operations, like subverting the French player's Algerian police and military units, converting them into more guerrilla warriors for the FLN. So what's the government player to do? Well, maybe rely on more French police and military. Less susceptible, right? Too bad they are limited in quantity and only come in with further commitment from the French government back home. Speaking of which, the more severe operations the FLN performs, the more intensive the outraged French government will commit to the cause. Of course, if the French occupation becomes too expansive, the FLN can draw in cells from neighboring countries Morocco and Tunisia. Everything is a balancing act in this game. Eventually, the event deck will reveal a propaganda card where players check for victory and perform some upkeep. If the last propaganda card is revealed and no one has won, then the player closest to their victory condition wins. While I like the semi-unpredictability of when this comes up, the event deck felt to me like the most rigid aspect of the game. On the one hand, without knowing what's coming down the pike, it's hard to know when to take big risks or play defensively, but on the other hand, the game might be too predictable without the introduction of some randomized element, but I'm sure that's part of the intent of the design. As an outsider coming into this series for the first time, I'll admit, learning this game was overwhelming. I've learned so many games, so many big and heavy games, but this series is cut from a different cloth. Don't get me wrong, the rulebooks are well laid out and the tutorial is structured and effectively carries you through learning the game, but from the way it presents rules to the terminology and language, even the fact that it acknowledges that a totally viable version of solo play is just playing both sides, it was exhausting each time I sat down with it to fully learn and meaningfully carry out the game. Speaking of solo, there's the automated FLN, the other way of playing this game solo, including a redonkulous flowchart of mesmerizing proportions that allows you to fully perform the FLN, more akin to what mid-weight hobby gamers are used to, though this is to Wingspan to Automa what a tank is to a tricycle, so know what you're getting into. While all aspects of the game, Banana's flowchart included, get easier and more fluid as you play more, this remains one of the crunchier and more nuanced games I've played, and unless you play it regularly, be prepared to have to learn over and over again. But there's a place for that type of game. Diving into Colonial Twilight has been such a rewarding experience, even if it feels like my cadence of life, with most of my gaming being done after my kid goes to bed, doesn't leave me with the best mental faculties to interact with it in the way that I want. To my surprise, I preferred the single player as both sides method of play over the automated FLN, since it reduced both complexity and pressure, and felt like I was a third party facilitating a story with tense and dynamic interactions rather than competing against the system itself. But in truth, I don't know when I'll play it again. I think I've had my time with it. I've enjoyed expanding my horizons and crossing a game off my list, but my jam still tends to be games that fit in between an hour or two, whose complexity comes from narrow but consequential decision spaces than the sort of scale this trades on. But it's clear why this series is so popular. Meticulously crafted, dutifully thematic, and beautifully, albeit modestly, presented, Colonial Twilight has only deepened my fascination with the Coin series and left me wanting to play more. If you enjoyed this video, we have all kinds of other reviews, interviews, and recommendations via writing, podcasts, and video here on our channel and website cardboardherald.com. Our content is audience supported, so if you want to show your support, please visit our Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Cardboard Herald.